Hey, everybody, welcome to this edition of the Politically Incorrect Podcast. I'm Jim Williams, your host. Now, as we get ready to celebrate the 4th of July weekend, we at News Talk Florida have an investigative report. It's called America Burns as Riots Against Police Brutality Increase, How We Can Fix This Problem. It was penned by Avneet Singh and, of course, Randy Shrewsberry. Now, this is a very complex and very interesting piece written by the duo, and it really gets into how we need to change policing. This is not defunding the police force. This is not abolishing the police force. This is how we can best train our police to serve and protect everybody. Now, of course, those of you who know the podcast know that Avneet is the founder of Voice of Mankind, a nonprofit think tank working with, to influence public opinion on issues that affect us all. They're here to make sense of a constantly changing world. Meanwhile, Randy is the head of the Institute for Criminal Justice Training Reform, which exists to save lives and reduce injury among public and police officers by reforming the deeply flawed, inadequate, and sometimes antiquated training models, policies, and procedures, and to legislate standards for employees in the United States criminal justice system, particularly for those with the power to arrest, detain, and commit killings. So that's a lot to be tackled, and Avneet and Randy, welcome. Let's dive right into it. Let's talk about your article. It's a joint article. It's an exclusive to News Talk Florida. And gentlemen, it is a fascinating read. Let's talk about how you came to this, and let's talk about your conclusions.
Well, so I would say, that demilitarization really begins at recruitment. So a really good example, I actually had a journalist out of Louisville reach out to me and ask me to look at a couple of different recruiting videos, one from Louisville, Kentucky, and another one from Lexington. And what was notable, which I've seen hundreds of these, is that the Louisville's police recruiting promo. It was a minute and a half, maybe 2-minute video, was rife with, boot camp style training, showing examples of calls for which, there's, people are dressed in fatigues, or they're carrying, weapons of war, driving in Humvees. Ironically, they show an example of a no-knock warrant, which is, they just banned because of the death of Breonna Taylor. So, I think that one of the things that we have to recognize is that, part of the pushback that we see from the police is that they themselves are going, well, wait a minute, this is the job that I was hired to do. This was the job that I was trained to do. And then we are simultaneously, as a society, especially those who are advocates, are saying, well, wait a minute, you're doing this, you're doing it wrong. And the reality is that they're doing it exactly as they were trained to do. So when we readdress, and Avneet's point is that, when we talk about demilitarization, we're talking about a very, very wide spectrum of what, how we've hired them, how we've trained them, how we've equipped them, what clothing they wear. If you look at training academies across the United States, the Bureau of Justice Statistics breaks it down to what are called stress or non-stressed academies, which really means it's either militarized or non-militarized. Only about 5% of the training academies are non-stress or non-militarized. The rest have, at least some, if not, I think the majority, 30-some%, reported that there were a balance between academics and militarized training. So if we've hired them with the mindset that they are soldiers and that they are off to fight a war, then these outcomes are not surprising at all.
One of the things that I find interesting, specifically on the no-knock warrant, is I wonder how that squares with the law of illegal. Is MAP versus Ohio 1962 is kind of the standard law for basically not entering a person's home without saying who you are, and that has been the standard since 1962.
Yeah.
So I don't understand how you would have a no-knock warrant that supersedes an existing law.
Well, I mean, we're seeing this actually in kind of a couple of different areas over the last 30 or 40 years. Same with shooting fleeing felons. Gardner versus Tennessee prohibited that pretty clearly, but we've had a shift in the judicial system as far as interpretations of these laws, and there's been given more and more deference back to the police. And look, I'm the first one to say, while I believe that there needs to be massive reforms in law enforcement, I always say there's something to be said about someone who's running towards danger that the rest of us are running away from, right? But in my view is that what we've come across is a really just a breakdown in any kind of balance whatsoever. And so things, like no-knock warrants or shooting fleeing suspects or, stop and frisk, these things, from a civil libertarian perspective, we have eroded the rights away of normal citizens. Now, I will tell you, no-knock warrants, there's a lot of work around there, right? I mean, a whisper of police open the door and no one answers, and then you tear down the door, probably still, meets the requirements of knock and announce. But only in a very strict legal term and not really any meaningful way. So I think that I think our society over the years have romanticized policing, for which we kind of sit back and say, look, they're doing a really tough job, and it's hard for us to really be playing Monday morning quarterback when we're not dealing or our job isn't out there to deal with these problems. And so we've just kind of let things loosen up to now to the point of where it's coming back to bite us. And now we have to close the door, which is much harder to do.
To your point, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms has an office in Washington, D.C. that they train people in, and it happened to be in a building where I used to have a studio that I would shoot some TV programming. And one day I came into the building with one of the ATF trainers, and I asked him about the ATF training, and he said, look, we're off today, so he allowed me to come up to the 8th and 9th floor of the building. On the 8th floor of the building was a mock-up of a office situation with desks and cubicles and such. And the one above it was on the ninth floor was a school, and the concept was they needed to get the old training of shoot the right person, not the wrong person. And now, understanding these are the elite people with firearms make it to the ATF. I mean, you don't just show up at the ATF and they teach you this stuff. So I asked him, what was the average score of the first time that he would bring a first-time person in? And most of these people came from the police force or from military. And he
Sure.
said, he goes, we're lucky if we come out of this first time through with a 50-50 result. He says, our goal is to, and it's a sports term, which I know everyone has heard, it's slow the game down. He says the adrenaline is rushing, everything is going, and he goes, that's the worst possible time to fire a firearm.
Yeah.
He goes, you need to be within yourself, slow the action down and say, all right, I'm about to pull the trigger on something that could kill someone. Do I need to pull that trigger? Or am I better served taking a beat and sizing up the situation? And over time, the ATF agents get, and I think the best they get is in the high 80s, low 90s percentile. So, that's all the way it is at this point in time. So, I think it's important that you think about even the top grade people at ATF, are not quite, perfect when it comes to this. Now,
Sure.
I was just saying, go ahead.
Well, I just want to interject, and because I think it's an important point, just very, very briefly, is that I think Joe Biden said recently, that the police should be, taught to shoot someone in the leg or in the arm versus, a fatal shot. And the problem with that argument, number one, is it's just derived from fictional television narratives that aren't realistic, because the reality is that officers have when they're forced to use deadly force, they're hard pressed to shoot someone, what they call center mass, someone's chest area, because stress situations, there's a lot that's happening psychologically. There's a lot that's happening with, adrenaline and, tunnel vision, these kinds of things.
Right.
So, a lot of these expectations are really just borne out in a good TV show versus what it really is in reality.
Avneet, I think part of what we're in this conversation need to understand, and you can bring to fore better than certainly I, is the approach of being more attuned to the community, so that when you do this, that that perhaps what you need is more of a combination police force that has some mental therapy in it and some ability to de-escalate what's going on at the time, as opposed to what we saw, just recently in the shooting, where the gentleman was in a Wendy's, had fallen asleep because he was intoxicated, had a 45-minute conversation with the police, and then all of a sudden, when he broke away, he got shot in the back. I have to believe that if there were trained, mental therapy people on hand, that they could have de-escalated that whole thing a whole lot easier.
Well, I mean, I would argue that the officer should have had additional tools to his disposal, for which, we really didn't need even. I mean, yeah, I don't disagree with you that a mental health professional would have helped in this situation, but I think that the bigger problem that this highlighted is a couple of things. Is one is excuse me, is that we have taken a punitive approach as a resolution to everything, right? I mean, in this case, no, he should not have been drinking and driving. We're all on board with that, right?
Right, 100%.
But was the only solution, when he is saying, hey, look, my sister's right down the way, right down the street, was there not alternatives other than an arrest, such as, call a cab, call a family member? I haven't been in policing in a while, but I was in the late '80s, all throughout the '90s and early 2000s, and I saw this kind of gradually go away. For when I started, we would work around to make sure that there's no need to drag this guy to jail, give him a citation, summons to appear in court, and there's some things like civil liability if they're giving him a ride and he has a wreck or something, the officer. So I understand that, but looking at that case is that it did not look like even those options were explored. But I want to hit to kind of what Avneet started in this conversation talking about, is about the necessity of demilitarization. And a part of that is that here's my concern is Rayshard Brooks should not have been killed, unequivocally. Anyone who watches this can see that he absolutely should not have been killed. But I do wonder, right? I can't help but consider, what role did militarization play and giving this officer the mindset that there was a perception of threat? What role, did training have, culture in the department, the equipment that he's been issued? And, I can't imagine that, number one, I mean, I can't imagine that, this isn't going to come up in his trial as a defense. And even while, again, unequivocally, he should, the deadly force was not necessary in that case, is that have we set the officers up for failure in these circumstances, for putting them in this warlike atmosphere, for which then all of a sudden, things that, in retrospect are clearly not threats, but at that moment, has offered a perception that it is.
Right. Well, some people fight back that saying, well, he took the taser and he shot the taser over his shoulder. Well, that's ridiculous. I mean, a taser is like a water pistol from distance. I mean, it's not doing anything. So, was he
even
armed?
If he was hit with it, in order for that to have really been a risk to his life, it would have meant that, I mean, tasers do carry some risk of death, but largely speaking, it would have meant that he would have had to be incapacitated. Then Mr. Brooks, would have then seized away, the officer's weapon and then shot and killed him with that. All the while another officer, I guess, would have just been standing there. And that's the problem, the problem. But when you look at training, right? A third of officer training goes around self-defense and tactical. So I'm so sorry, I'm having some allergies. So the vast majority of just the basis of training is, this fear-based, threat is lurking around every corner. And then on top of that, then it's also integrated in really pretty much every single topic. And I give an example that, even when an officer is taught about how to do report writing, right? We're talking about the mechanics of filling out forms and how to write affidavits, those kinds of things.
Right.
officer safety, quote unquote, is still intertwined in this. Like, how do you stand? What's the distance that you maintain while you're writing a report? Do you hand someone a pen that they could, later turn around and jab you in the neck with it? Things that are really, highly, highly, highly unlikely to ever happen in the first place. But, it is this training based on possibility instead of probability. And then therefore, I don't know if I'm getting this expression right, is, if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Right. And so that's what I worry about in situations like, in Atlanta. I mean, obviously, George Floyd, that's a whole different case. That was just flat murder. But how much accountability are we expecting of particular employees if this is the way that they have been trained or the environment has equipped them to behave in this way?
Avneet, where do you fall down in the way of, I know civil liberties are very important to you, and I think that you talk, we've talked about this in the past. How do you think a police force 2020 and beyond needs to be different than the police forces that we've had up to this point? Because clearly we haven't necessarily got it all right.
Right. So I think it's, the change really needs to come in two different ways. One is, as we did discuss, it's going to be demilitarize the police, which really means, replace military tactics with less aggressive forms of policing. And this comes back to training, which is what Randy talked about, not allowing them to use military-grade hardware, surveillance drone, not allowing them to buzz protesters with helicopters and tactics that they learned from wars in the Middle East. None of that belongs in policing. None of that should be there. The second part of this, which is, again, I think definitely worth exploring more is and again, this is, as you said, where I put on my libertarian hat. This is where I think it's, they should be, we should use this as an opportunity to save police cost and pass on that savings to people, maybe in the form of lower local taxes. Because I believe, when you see all the military drones, the cost of flying helicopters, the cost of surveillance drones, the cost of training people with military tactics, if all of that goes away, there is bound to be, and this I'm not we'll talk more about, but there could be some savings there, which I believe that it should be passed back to the public so that people can use that money. They can spend it to buy essential services, stimulate the economy. So there's benefits of that, and people feel good about it. So I think definitely I would propose for for using this opportunity to reduce the cost of policing and pass it on to the public. The second option, which again would be good, is if there isn't a significant cost saving, then it just means that you just reallocate the budget to training police differently, because it might not be possible to save money. I mean, Randy will talk more about the 1033 program, where a lot of the military grade hardware really comes is hand-me-downs from the military. So there might not be a significant cost savings there, but we can try for that and put that money into people's pocket. And Randy, you want to talk about the possibilities? How can we save money? How can we save money?
Sure. I mean, so if you're not familiar with the 1033 program, it is a military surplus program for which military-grade equipment that is no longer being used or was an over-manufacturer, which is pretty common as well, that's then handed to police departments at little to no cost. In fact, I've heard like $1 or something like that. And there's a couple of problems with this is one is, I think as we talk about tax savings and that sort of thing, I think it speaks to, maybe an examination on the Pentagon side about, how we're spending and coming up with so much surplus. But that's another fight for, someone else's cause. But one of the problems with the program is that when this equipment is handed down to local departments, the agencies have to submit it's either an annual or biannual report that shows that they have a continued need for this equipment. So when we look at policing in America, there's 18,000 local law enforcement agencies across the country. Half of those are less than departments of 10 police officers. So, and this is very often of where a lot of this equipment is landing. So what happens is that cases for which a large SWAT presence isn't really necessary. It's still kind of in the back of the minds of, the police administration and supervision that, hey, we've got to be able to show that that we need this equipment so we can keep it, for the next year. And so then the choices become, of using equipment that you otherwise really wouldn't have needed or probably wouldn't have even been considered. What we know is that those departments that are more and more militarized logically have higher use of force issues. Higher use of force issues then become higher liability. And so to me, like when we look at, because the 1033 program, these large ticket items are being provided from the government, I think Avneet really spelled it out that, there's a lot of secondary costs like training and maintenance and those kinds of things that the local agencies are absorbing. But to me, where the big cost saving comes from this demilitarization process is through civil liability and settlements. Is that when I speak about it from a fiscal manner, right, or matter, first and foremost is if we reduce harm or reduce loss of life, that's the number one goal. But when we look at kind of these residual problems that it has, is that if we can reduce use of force instances, then we're going to reduce civil liability, which is then in turn going to save taxpayers a lot of money. One of the things Avneet and I were talking about this recently is that that just drives me just nuts is that when I read stories or I hear on the media that the city of Los Angeles paid certain amount of millions of dollars. No, it wasn't the city of Los Angeles. It was the taxpayers of Los Angeles paid this. And so, if, to Avneet's point, we can have a discussion about where this money goes, but some, at least, if we could turn around and reinvest and expand training to, instead of teaching someone in a day about de-escalation to where they have the room to be able to spend, a good amount of time, and learning about de-escalation, human behavior, mental illness, these kind of wide variety of things that they're just barely touching on in, a 6-month academy. Avneet has, said as well as, turning this money and giving it back to the taxpayers. So, as a kind of passive stimulus so that, taxpayers themselves are spending money in the economy, which then improves the community as a whole.
Let me ask you guys, both of you, about something that worries me. And it's outside the police department. And that is these states that now have, open carry plus add to that the concept of stand your ground. You have people now. You have citizens who are taking on the role of police and, in essence, shooting people because, quote unquote, I felt threatened. Well, if you feel threatened and the person doesn't have a gun, call a policeman. I think these states have gotten it way wrong by doing what clearly is inviting them, inviting the potential of what happened to Trayvon Martin in Florida and some of these other shootings that the police could perhaps have avoided, by helping them. But no, stand your ground is I have the right to protect my home, my property, whatever, my neighborhood. Well, you do have a right, but you don't have the right to take someone's life.
So I mean, I'm probably to the left of most as it comes to the Second Amendment. I think I think that our country is, we're awash with guns, which doesn't, in of itself mean that we're going to be a violent culture. Canada has a lot of guns as well, and doesn't see a fraction of the gun violence that we have. And I think, one is, we've got to come to terms as, to really understanding to the root of why, why do we resort to gun violence at the rates that we do in our country. However, even if we left things as status quo, I'm in total agreement that, these open carries or stand your ground laws is only expanding this idea, that gun violence is just a norm, and that the protection of property is equal to the protection of life. And so when we look at statistics, we're not real informed as a society, about the realities of gun violence. Having a gun in your home, you're not more likely to protect your family. You're actually more likely to be, shot by your own weapon or be used in a suicide. Women are far more likely to die at the hands of gun violence if a gun is in the home. So, there's huge issues as it relates, just to our attitudes as it comes to guns. But that being said, is the Second Amendment's not going anywhere. So what I think is important that we have to start reframing the conversations again. This kind of goes back to what I say is how we have romanticized policing is that we've also kind of romanticized a story. You'll see 78-year-old lady shoots burglars or whatever,
Right.
Protecting their home, and this gets a lot of media play. It really it feeds to the biases of those who are in support of these very lax gun laws, instead of us really just taking an honest scientific approach to say that no, those things are anecdotal. We don't want vigilantes walking around an open carry or stand your ground. And let's be honest too, is that these kinds of laws, have a very distinct, ways of enforcement or allowance depending on race, right? So, we saw protest around people wanting, to not be inside anymore because of the pandemic or not wanting
Right.
to wear masks. And you have, just people very openly walking around with AR-15s or assault
Right.
rifles. And the police's response, was none. However, in response to George Floyd, if there's someone who has seen, a person of color who's seen with a weapon, the response is incredibly different. when it's folks of color. So, I just think they're all just a terrible idea.
Well, just to kind of put a bow on the Second Amendment, if you go back to the mid 1990s when Bill Clinton was able to get the assault rifle ban, he would never have gotten the votes to get that passed had it not been for 5 living presidents: Reagan, Carter, Gerald Ford, and gosh, I forget the other one. Johnson. No, not Johnson. It would have been anyway. George Herbert Walker Bush. That's who it was. What that would never have gotten across the finish line had it not been for Reagan, because Reagan literally wrote a handwritten note to each of the Republicans, and he was the first president ever endorsed by the National Rifle Association. Okay, so he was saying, no, this is not right. So fast forward to the 2000s, where basically the law that is the standing law on what the Second Amendment is was Heller versus DC. You can Google it, folks. We won't go into details here, but what it was, it had to do with Heller being a resident of the District of Columbia. He had a handgun. The district had banned handguns during a time when there was quite a bit of violence going on in Washington. Heller took them to court. Supreme Court ruled that Heller was allowed to own a gun because it was a Second Amendment right. But in that, Justice Antonin Scalia, and there doesn't get many, there didn't get, I should say, he's passed now, many more conservative people than Scalia, wrote in that case that for the majority that Heller had every right to this gun. However, and this is Scalia writing, that weapons of war and automatic pistols, et cetera, should not be covered by the Second Amendment, because the need for a militia, which is what you're talking about, the guys walking around with the AR-15s as if they're part of some army, was not covered by, or should not be covered by, the Second Amendment. So you've got Reagan, first person endorsed by the NRA, and Scalia, one of the most conservative justices we probably have had in decades, both saying, yeah, there's a right to a Second Amendment, but there's not a right to own weapons of war. And part of this new policing concept, and like both of your takes on this, is that perhaps what we should be doing is, if you ask the police chiefs of, I think it was the top 100 cities in the country, they don't want to go out and have to, like these mass shooting situations, have to come and face someone who's already outmanned them in gun power ahead of the time. I mean, there's a guy with an AR-15 rifle and God knows how many rounds, and you're showing up, prepared to fight that battle. So hopefully part of the policing will be also talking about, reasonably smart gun laws.
Well, the problem, and I mean, I agree with you, about smart gun laws. But part of the problem as well is that, even though that, there's evidence, that, I mean, I think that most would agree on, especially if we have, Scalia on our side, is that, there does have to be a line drawn at some point about, you can't you can't have a flamethrower, you can't have
Right.
a missile launch. I mean, there has to be. John Oliver on HBO's says eloquently, where do you draw the line? Well, somewhere, and so then collectively we have to decide where that somewhere is. But a part of the problem too is that even handgun violence is far more, far more of an issue than with semi-automatics. And my fear is that it was in the late 80s, I believe, that the North Hollywood shootout, where the bank robbers came in, they were heavily armed. And that became a turning point for how we were arming the police. And I remember in the very early 1990s, the very first time I had gone to Mexico and I saw the federal police, on foot patrol, and they were walking around with semi-automatic weapons, and I was like, oh my God, I can't dream that, and I was a young police officer at the time. I was like, I can't dream of having to, walk around with an AR-15 in my hand. And then, through the crime bill, through, the mass hysteria around the crack epidemic, anecdotal situations, that like from North Hollywood, or, a few circumstances, then all of a sudden we have made it a very, very normal for officers to be carrying these weapons of war as well. And so I think, I don't have a problem with very small specialized units that, that may be responsible in responding, to these kinds of incidents. Like, you have a guy, as a sniper in Las Vegas, killing lots of people. I mean, obviously we have to have we have to have some sort of law enforcement response to those kinds of things. But, for just Joe policeman, who is driving, doing regular patrol duties, having these kinds of weapons, I think further perpetuates this mindset in America, broadly speaking, about, the need for these kinds of guns. So if you're seeing that the cops need them, all the cops need them, not just a small specialized unit, then I think it's, it's not too far of a leap to say, well, hey, I need one too. What if I call the police who have them and we've said they needed them and they're not able to make it, then I want to do that as well. So I think Avneet brought up very early, even like when we're talking about cost of equipment, these are things that are not necessarily being handed down from the 1033 program or the use of helicopters. I mean, living in LA, in different parts of the city, it feels, you have helicopters, 2 or 3 helicopters flying around, armed officers dressed, decked out in fatigues. It feels like a war zone. And the ramifications of that is wide.
Avneet, do you think politically we are ready to have this conversation and we're ready to make this transformation?
Very unlikely. I think it's both President Trump and Biden have said, they support limited reforms, but they're not really going to go beyond that. And the problem with reform is that it just becomes too weak a word. That's just, it's just too weak and it would just lead to nothing concrete being done. And I think also there's a lot of the fear, uncertainty, and doubt, FUD, being spread around, that people are trying to abolish the police, or they're trying to defund the police, or so there's a lot of that uncertainty and doubt being spread around, which in a way suggests that there is enough opposition to genuine reform. I think it's in the article we also highlight several instances. A good example is San Diego police and the San Diego city, where more than 4,000 people called in and turned up and said, we want something to be done about it, and the city officials said, no, nothing will be done. We're not gonna, we will probably have some reform, and that's about it. So I think there's a lot of resistance. There's resistance from the police. They also spent millions of dollars. I think it's $80 million with New York police. So they spend a lot of money pushing back. Yeah, it's $80 million with New York City police. They use that money for lobbying, and it will be used to push back on any reform. So I think it's the combination of using the media to spread fear, uncertainty, and doubt to misrepresent what demilitarization of the police is about, using the police using its own lobbyists and their extensive financial resources to push back on this. And also both President Trump and Joe Biden at the highest level have said they only support limited reforms. So it's going to be an uphill challenge. However, there is also talk of there is the law that's the Justice in Policing Act, which does sound very promising. It's been proposed, and it seems to be a step in the right direction. But I don't know how far that will go.
One of the things, guys, that I think is important that we highlight, and that is that you can be both supportive of the police and also supportive of Black Lives Matter. It's not a binary choice, which in some regards is unfortunate being made to be that way. I have great respect for the police department. I have worked with police on numerous occasions. They are here to, as the saying on the cars goes, serve and protect. But by the same token, if you see, the situations we've talked about here, that supporting Black Lives Matter doesn't mean you hate the police department. And reforming the police department doesn't mean you hate police. It means that we as a country should be more attuned to what policing in 2020 and beyond is all about, as opposed to what it was and what it has been for decades at this point in time. And I think both of you bring fantastic points to bear on how we can revolutionize, if you will, or retool, redo, whatever you want to call it, the demilitarization of the police department, while at the same time bringing forth a new and evolved, I guess would be a better way of putting it, police department. And that's just, it hopefully would be common sense that every business adapts and changes. We have to adapt and change in our policing models, or this is going to be chaos for the rest of our lives.
Well, and if I may jump into that point, is it because I think that really speaks to a lot in of the problems that we are facing, as well as kind of the pushback that we're receiving, is that policing in America really hasn't ever fundamentally changed.
Mm-hmm.
We've it started as slave patrols, then into property protection. We had an expansion of kind of how policing was to be viewed at in the late 50s, early 60s with the introduction of SWAT, and then we've just increased, this militarization. So this re-envisioning of what policing and public safety needs to be, I think, is the very topic that I'm hoping that the tragedy of George Floyd and the continued media attention that we're getting. I mean, I'm with Avneet to say I'm concerned that there still may not be enough political will. But when we look at what is it that we're asking the police to do in and dealing with, quality of life crimes such as, homelessness or, vandalism or, petty, the broken windows theories that we know that do not work. Doing this over these years have pulled away the primary responsibilities of what law enforcement was intended, and that was to prevent crime, to be keepers of peace, and then to solve crime. And one of the really major issues that I speak about pretty regularly is that you look at violent crime clearance rates, solve rates in the United States. 40% of homicides go unsolved. 40%. That's an astonishing number. 70% of sexual assault and rape cases go unsolved. And simultaneously, we're seeing police resources being used, to deal with whether or not someone, is sleeping in a tent, or dealing with someone who needs a social worker, not a jail cell. And so, which then in turn creates this kind of breakdown of trust between the community and the police with this, when you have a heavy-handed enforcement, which then ripples across, the relationships between especially communities of color, their willingness to participate in helping reduce crime or solve crime, and then, just the pure math of manpower hours. There's only so much that time in the day, and if we're not prioritizing what policing really should be, then I fear that we remain stuck in this cycle that we've seen, especially grow in the last 30 years.
And just before we put a button on this, folks, Avneet and Randy, let's talk a little bit about the importance of police in the community and having better relations with the communities, like in Baltimore and Chicago and Detroit and anywhere for that matter. But some places where we've had increased inner city crime.
Sure. Well, so I think that first and foremost, is that we have to come, we have to be on the same page of the reality and the honesty of what has happened. Is there has been an over policing of communities of color. There has been higher instances of police brutality in areas of color. We know, as a society, that education and poverty are the two major contributors of crime. And if we continue not to tackle that, and all the while using all the resources, just to try to jail our way out of this, is that we're going to have a continued breakdown of trust if we don't re-examine. I would advocate, a total end, but at minimum, if we don't re-examine the war on drugs and its massive negative impact that it's had, especially in urban areas. And when we do that, we have to come to terms that there is, there's a different level of policing or a different style of policing, dependent upon your zip code. We know that, as an example, drug use and drug dealing is equal among races, but African Americans are far more likely to be arrested for dealing or using drugs. They're far more likely to get a heavier sentence. They're far more likely to get more strict conditions in probation and parole. And this isn't just African Americans; it's Native Americans and Latinos as well. So, if we're not, if we're not at least starting at a point of being intellectually honest and saying, hey, look, the scales of justice has not been evenly distributed among everyone. If we don't get to that starting point, then it's going to be difficult for us to change. And if we don't change, then the relationships between the community and the police, which is wrought with distrust, it isn't going to improve. And I attribute, I think that police officers need to be trained better, about how to solve crimes versus enforcement of petty crimes. I think that, more technology. I think on the educational side, there's more that we can do. But I also think that, the reliance of solving crimes very often comes from community members. And if you have this breakdown of trust, then people aren't standing in line to come up and say, like, hey, I know who, burglarized the Best Buy in my neighborhood, or, I knew who was involved in this shooting, because there's an adversarial relationship, even among those who aren't involved in any crimes. They're just a member of the community that they're watching around, seeing that this disproportionate enforcement happen in their neighborhood versus others.
Avneet, why don't you close us out here by giving us a preview of the story, which folks are going to be able to see on News Talk Florida here in the next 24 hours.
Yeah, so I think the story or the article we're going to write is just going to cover most of the points we discussed. Is that one is that why is there rioting? The oppression that Black Americans feel that they're being exposed to. It also covers another very interesting point that this is beyond morality. It's not just let's be nice to our fellow citizens. It's bigger than that, and that is that we also want to use the money that's currently being used for militarizing the police. We want to use it for social services and social investment, and that is something that everyone needs, irrespective of our background. And also, lastly, I want to talk briefly about there has been there's an effort to to sow fear, uncertainty, and doubt that we don't know what exactly to do. What does reform involve? I think it's important to highlight the excellent work Randy and his Institute for Criminal Justice Training Reform has been doing for decades. It's like we know we have the inside information, we know what we need to do, and it's not a massive change. It's just better training with the view to demilitarize the police. So I think it's important to highlight that we have the answers, and they're not a harsh like defund the police or abolish the police. It's much simpler, logical solution that we all must work on, even after the spotlight goes away from the need for police reform.
Gentlemen, why don't you both give us your social media, how we can follow you, and definitely let's see if we can build up those
Sure.
Twitter accounts and all the other stuff that goes with it.
Yeah, so I work for the Voice of Mankind, which is a nonprofit think tank working to influence public opinion on issues that affect us all. So as I say, we are here to make sense of the changing world.
Thank God someone is. Randy, give us your...
Sure. Well, the Institute for Criminal Justice Training Reform really exists at examining how education can improve public safety and the relationships between the community and public safety. Our website is trainingreform.org. And on Twitter and Facebook, it's just /training reform. We are the only nonprofit advocacy organization that's addressing reform by the view of or through the lens of examining training.
Outstanding. Well, Randy and Avneet, it's always a pleasure. Look forward to having another chat with you two somewhere down the line. And I think that we haven't solved all the problems of the world, but we certainly gave folks enough to really get thinking about the process of demilitarizing the police force and getting true and meaningful change in how law enforcement works from 2020 on. We'll be back with more of the Politically Incorrect podcast right after this.
At BMW, we know leaving the road wasn't easy, but anticipating our return taught us to appreciate every drive. The exhilaration of the ultimate adventure. Moments spent with your favorite co-pilots. And the freedom to explore just because. Our time to rejoin the road is finally here.
Hey, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Now, if you're not one of the over 30,000 people taking time to subscribe to the Politically Incorrect podcast, well, first of all, shame on you. Second of all, we make it simple. You can find us at the Apple Podcast Store. You can find us at Google Play in the Google Podcast Store. We can also be found at Spreaker, Stitcher, Spotify, as well as, of course, TuneIn Radio, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, to name a few. Now, if you have a connected device like Alexa or Siri or any of the Google devices, all you have to do is say, hey, Alexa, please play the latest edition of the Politically Incorrect podcast, and they will do it for you. So, folks, we do our best to make certain that you get to know what's going on and in this ever-changing world. And we would greatly appreciate you subscribing. So go out there today and subscribe and get a brand new edition of the podcast sent to your phone, your tablet, or both, hopefully, every week. All right. Well, as we get ready here for the 4th of July weekend, be sure to wear your masks, be sure to self-distance, and do your best to cut down on this COVID-19 pandemic, which is right now paralyzing our country. The more we adhere to science, the more we wear the masks, the more that we social distance, the more that we do our part, the faster we can get back to work, the faster that things will become part of what will undoubtedly be the new normal. So when you're out there this weekend, think of our troops, think of all the people who have died to protect your rights and my rights, and consider that we are now battling a pandemic on the front lines, which means as every one of us out there are citizen soldiers, we need to wear our masks, we need to social distance, and we need to play it smart, okay? It is not taking away anyone's civil rights by asking you to wear a mask. It's just a smart thing to do. If you don't have a mask, a facial covering is just as good. So please do that for all of us. Have a safe and wonderful holiday weekend. Thanks, of course, to Randy and to Avneet for joining us. And by all means, read their very, very compelling story on News Talk Florida right now. Until next week, I'm Jim Williams for the entire team here at the Politically Incorrect Podcast. Have a wonderful and safe holiday weekend.